In the 1980s, a cell light was on, and a person was hanging by a chain. His body was covered in bruises and blood from being tortured. Even his feet were tied so he couldn't escape. A fly then crawled on his face, but he still looked calm. Despite all this, food was the first word out of his mouth after all the interrogation and torture. The soldiers were shocked to hear what he had just said. One of the torturers said that South Korean soldiers could serve the spies with food, but they didn't do that. The man who was being tortured then said that he would tell everyone if they gave him food. The chief officer asked if he meant it. He says he will give him food, but he must tell him about his destination and infiltration route in return. The prisoner agreed and said he was just trying to make a living by joining the army, but this way he would starve to death. The chief officer ordered his subordinates to bring food from the kitchen. But his subordinates questioned his order, so the chief officer got angry and ordered him to shut up. He tells them that they have to hand this prisoner over to their superiors tomorrow, and that they will steal all their hard work if they can't get the information out of him. The subordinate finally understood and followed his orders. The prisoner was finally taken down and served food. He was given a spoon and chopsticks to eat his food, but his hands were still chained. He held the spoon with his fingers and started scooping up the soup. The prisoner then said that this soup tastes bland. Then he took one of the chopsticks and said that military food was always very strange. One of the army's underlings said that the taste of the food was not important right now. They were angry and intended to kill the prisoner. Suddenly, the chopstick stabbed the chief officer's forehead. At first, they did not understand what had happened. But then, the officer's head fell on the table because he was dead. Now the soldiers were shocked to see this as they couldn't see anything that was happening. The prisoner then said that the taste of the food was important. He held chopsticks in his hand. All the soldiers ran towards him to kill him, but the prisoner was able to kill them all with a chopstick. He then told the dead men that he was a senior intelligence sergeant named Janggon. His infiltration route was to swim through the ocean, and his goal was to kill them in the same way he had just done. Then he saw the fly that was bothering him before, so he aimed at it with his chopsticks and killed it. Janggon also thought that he should stop doing this. After a while, in the city of Seoul, Janggon is sitting with Lieutenant Colonel Park in a small restaurant. Lieutenant Colonel Park tells him that there is no one like him in their company, so why does he want to quit? Janggon replies that military food has lost its taste. Their food then arrived, and the delighted lieutenant smiled and added the chunks of meat to the bone soup. He then gave the rest to Janggon. But Janggon stops him with chopsticks and says he doesn't eat like that. Janggon took the rice without scooping it all out at once. He then added it to the soup. This way he could enjoy the meal to the end without the rice getting soggy. As he eats, Lieutenant Colonel Park asks if he will not quit because of the operation. Janggon asks what he's asking because he just came back after finishing the surgery this time. Lieutenant Colonel Park said that he must have known exactly what operation he was referring to. Lieutenant Colonel Park said that at that time the plan was to return alive, and when Janggon returned alone, he did not fail in his operation. But Janggon says it's not about the operation. After a pause in their conversation, Janggon thanked Lieutenant Colonel Park for taking in a person like him who had no home and helping him earn money. Lieutenant Colonel Park smiles and says, Janggon did everything well, and he is sure Janggon will be recognized for his abilities even after he is gone. 1 year later, at a construction site, 2 workers commented on Janggon's work that he was very efficient at carrying heavy loads and digging. As Lieutenant Colonel Park said before, his abilities had been recognized, but he had not had an easy life. However, Janggon tries his own way. Lunch break finally came, and Janggon went to the nearest bank. Here he saw a girl at the counter busy dealing with older women. The girl looked at him, and Janggon waved at her with a smile. During break time, Janggon will go to the bank. It all started 1 year ago when he started working at a construction company. When he got his first paycheck, his owner advised him to save for the future because it would help him do what he wanted. But Janggon doesn't know what he wants to do in the future, and there is nothing he wants to do with money. So the next day, Janggon went to a nearby bank during his lunch break and opened an account there. That day he saw the girl for the first time and fell in love with her at first sight. After that, Janggon started going there every lunch break to see her, and every time he went there, he only saved 5,000 won, which was not a big amount. He wanted to go there as often as possible. After a year, the relationship that had built up between them was like the accumulation of interest in a bank book. Originally, Janggon wanted the girl to recognize his face. Then they remember each other's names. He also found out that Seona was born into a very harmonious family, but with low finances. So as soon as she graduated from high school, she got a job at this bank and has been working until now. Janggon tells Seona that he was previously a soldier, and he worked at a construction site near a bank, living alone without a home or family to return to. Seona asked, Janggon wasn't he in the military for a long time, and asked why Janggon didn't have any money from it. Janggon replied that he gave everything to the families of soldiers who died while serving in the same unit as him. Janggon doesn't have a family, but they have parents, wife and children too. But for Janggon it doesn't matter because he will work hard to save money again. Seona seemed impressed to hear that. Back to the present, as usual. Janggon asked Seona for help today. Seona received the book and advised Janggon not to do this, and just save the money and then deposit it into a savings account with installments once a month. Because if not, this will be a hard job for Janggon. Janggon didn't know he had to do that, but he said if he did, he would only be able to see Seonga once a month. Seona's face turned red and she returned Janggon's savings book. Like that, Janggon has a reason to live, but he still can't live well. He listened to the news on TV while lying on the couch at home tired. Janggon began to think about his past. When he became an adult, he entered the military and received various kinds of special training. He survived missions of high difficulty such as bombing, infiltration, and assassination. And Janggon does his best at the job. However, in recent years, he has felt that the things he is good at are not helping him make money, or he thinks that he might be bad at making money. He sighed and thought that he just wanted to eat good food. Shortly thereafter, he heard someone ringing the doorbell. The person who rang the bell asked if this was the residence of First Sergeant Janggon. Janggon partially opens the door and asks who he is. The person also asked if Janggon remembered him and introduced himself as Jo Tae-moon. He said they had worked together before. Janggon also recognizes that he is Staff Sergeant Jo. Staff Sergeant Jo Tae-moon, the successor who was once involved in an operation with Janggon. He has sufficient qualifications as a soldier. But in the end, he was discharged from the military because of his temperamental nature. Janggon was surprised to see Jo Tae-moon dressed well and wearing an expensive watch. Janggon then asked Jo Tae-moon how he found him. Jo Tae-moon replied that he heard Janggon had left the company and he looked everywhere for him and finally found him. He tells Janggon that he has a job request for him. Out of curiosity, Janggon asked what kind of job. Jo Tae-moon also answered that it was the job that Janggon was best at. Janggon says he doesn't want to get his hands dirty for money. Jo Tae-moon clarifies that he doesn't want him to kill anyone, he just wants Janggon to teach someone a lesson. Janggon gets serious and asks him to be honest about what he wants. Jo Tae-moon said he was a successful businessman in the eyes of the public, but in reality, he is the boss of a gang, and the person Jo Tae-moon wants Janggon to take care of is the boss of another gang. Janggon tells him that he didn't leave his army job to do something like that. Jo Tae-moon, who was offended, asked what he meant by something like that. He asks if he quit his job to live in a rundown place like this. Janggon asks him to be careful with what he says. Jo Tae-moon then said if he agrees to do this job, he will pay him 50 million won, and with that money, he can buy a nice house or start a business to improve his life. Janggon thought he couldn't save that much even in 10 years while working at a construction job. Jo Tae-moon gave him his card and said he could visit him if he changed his mind. Before Jo Tae-moon left, he said that it was strange that someone like Janggon tried to avoid doing something he was good at. Janggon put his business card on the table and then lay down on the floor. He didn't think he came here to live like this, but he intended to try doing what he had been doing a little longer and find out if he really couldn't live without doing the thing he was good at. While thinking about this, Janggon finally fell asleep. The next day, at the construction site, many racks of cement bags were present there. When Janggon arrived, his boss asked him to take all these bags to where they were needed. Janggon then asked where the other workers were. His boss replied that he only called him because he saw him a few days ago carrying a load and he thought he could do this job without any help. Janggon looked at his smiling face and wondered if this man was really sane. Outside the bank, Seong-seona and her co-worker were standing outside the bank drinking tea. She looked up at the sky and wondered how she was going to get through the day. Her colleague asked her why she said that when her face was always bright during lunchtime. Seong-seona asked what she was talking about. Her colleague replied that she was really nice to Janggon, so she asked if she was attracted to him. Seong-seona replied that he only came to deposit money into his savings account. She said if this was a shop, then Janggon would be one of their regular customers, so she should treat him well. Her colleague says she might be right, but Janggon doesn't look that handsome, nor is he rich. This comment made Seong-seona uncomfortable. She smiled and said, Janggon may not be handsome, but she has a nice body. Her colleague replied that he worked at a construction site and had to lift bricks and heavy loads all day. However, Seong-seona said her father also used to work on construction sites, but never had a body like him. Seong then leaned against her colleague and thanked her for meddling in her affairs. She warns her that she knows about her affair with the manager who looks down on them because they are from an all-girls technical high school. After returning to her counter, Seong-seona wondered why she was angry before when she talked about Janggon. Then Janggon suddenly entered the bank and waved at her. Seong-seona said, "It's not lunch break yet, so why is he here?" Janggon replied that he would be busy later and came a little earlier. Seong-seona then asked if he was here to put money in his account. But Janggon said that today he came to see Seong-seona. While waving at her, Janggon said he would deposit a lot of money in his account once he returned. Seong-seona's cheeks turned red and thought that Janggon had just come to meet her here. She asked what was wrong with Janggon because he was suddenly like this. Janggon headed to the bus terminal and took a ticket to go to Daesan. He immediately contacted Jo Tae-moon, accepted his offer, and headed to Daesan. While sitting on the bus, Janggon saw Jo Tae-moon's business card. He thought things might get better like what Jo Tae-moon said. When he arrived, Jo Tae-moon and his driver were already there to pick him up. When they had entered the car, Jo Tae-moon showed an image of a target named Park Gwan-ho. He tells him that the two of them are fighting for the rights to a tourist hotel slot machine. Jo Tae-moon wanted to barge in and fight one-on-one and settle all of this himself, but he couldn't fight him head-on because this way he would lose the rights to the slot machine. But if an unknown outsider who had nothing to do with them suddenly appeared and did it, then Park Gwan-ho probably wouldn't be able to show his face around here for a while and everything would run smoothly. Jo Tae-moon then warns that it won't be easy because Lieutenant Colonel Park knows he will come for him, so he is under safe guard. He suggested that he wait a moment until he lowered his guard. Janggon then asked him what time it was. Jo Tae-moon was confused and answered that it was 1:30. Janggon also said that meant there was still a lot of time left until 4:30 in the afternoon. As Jo Tae-moon was still confused, Janggon informed the bank that it closed at 4:30 p.m. Now he asked him to take him to Park Gwan-ho's place so he could take care of him quickly. So Jo Tae-moon was able to deposit money in his bank account before the bank closed. Jo Tae-moon said if he left now, he would have to fight many people, but Janggon thought it would be fine. After feeling stunned, Jo Tae-moon finally agreed to Janggon's request. Jo Tae-moon took him to the hotel where Park Gwan-ho and his subordinates had lunch. He also warned him about the special guard who was always with Park Gwan-ho. The man used to be a wrestler, so he advised Janggon to be careful. Janggon also asked what the best dish in this restaurant. The driver told him that here are good fried dumplings. Janggon gets out of the car and says he'll be right back. The driver also asked Jo Tae-moon if he was sure that Janggon was enough for this job. Jo Taemoon replied that if another person like Do Janggon appeared, the world would be in chaos. Inside the restaurant, Park Gwan-ho was enjoying his lunch while all of his subordinates were there as well. Do Janggon sits at a separate table in the corner with fried dumplings in front of him. He took the soy sauce and, at a ratio of 1:1, poured it into the bowl. He sprinkled red pepper powder in it and dipped the dumplings in it. Do Janggon then ate it, and the taste of the food really satisfied him. Do Janggon finished his food and drank his drink. Do Janggon, who felt very satisfied, thanked him for this delicious food. After that, he started throwing glasses at Park Gwan-ho and smashed them against the wall behind him. The fat man got angry and asked what was wrong with him. Do Janggon says he's trying to start a fight because the sound of his boss chewing food is annoying. Park Gwan-ho looked at him in annoyance and ordered his men to arrest him. They all ran towards him to attack him. In the face of the gang members running towards him, Do Janggon smiled. After a while, food was scattered, furniture was broken, and beaten men were everywhere on the floor. Only Do Janggon is standing with his hands in his pockets. The battered Park Gwan-ho asked who he was because there was no way he didn't know a man as strong as him in this field. Do Janggon replied that he could remember him as an outsider with severe anger management issues. Park Gwan-ho grinned with his nose bleeding and asked who sent it. He said he would pay him double if he worked with him. Do Janggon wasn't sure if that person had enough money to pay him 100 million won. While Park Gwan-ho was talking something, Do Janggon asked him why he stopped talking. Suddenly he realized that there was someone behind him. The fat man was holding a chair in his hand and ready to attack him. Do Janggon defended himself using his arms. When the fat man attacked, he felt excruciating pain, like something inside his body had broken. He was about to hit him again, but Do Janggon kicked him in the groin. Tears quickly streamed down his face. Due to the pain, he fell to the ground and became unconscious. Do Janggon then raised his leg and kicked the fat man hard. Do Janggon then looked at Park Gwan-ho and asked if 4:30 in the afternoon was past. A nervous Park Gwan-ho checked his watch and said it wasn't even 2 p.m. yet. Do Janggon said it was good and left. When Do Janggon walked away, Park Gwan-ho asked while shouting what was so good. Do Janggon and Jo Taemoon came out of the bank after depositing money in Do Janggon's account. Jo Taemoon said he didn't think he would make it before when the bank closed. Jo Taemoon then asked what he would do with this money. Do Janggon answered that he wasn't sure, but he saw some apartments near the bus terminal this morning and maybe he would buy one there. Jo Taemoon also said that the neighborhood was not very good, so he advised Do Janggon to look for an apartment somewhere in the middle of Seoul. Do Janggon thinks he might try stocks since everyone is doing that nowadays. Jo Taemoon asked if he had a shop in mind. He suggested that he buy Han Electronics, as there was no chance for the company to go bankrupt, as it was responsible for supplying electricity throughout the country. Do Janggon said Sam Electronics seemed fine to him, because the company's new chairman was a smart man. Suddenly, he felt pain as if he had just been electrocuted. Do Janggon then asked if they could go to the hospital because he was sick where he got hit. Jo Taemoon said they could go to the hospital he visited regularly. Do Janggon asks what he means regularly. He replies that there is an old doctor who doesn't seem surprised when he shows up there after being stabbed or injured. When he gets there, Do Janggon's arms are plastered and he wonders what happened to him. The doctor told him that his arm was fractured and that the fracture would take a month to heal. A shocked Do Janggon asks if he should stay like this for a month. Doctors warned him not to use his arm as it would delay the healing process. Do Janggon didn't like the situation where he was trapped in a stupid situation. Jo Taemoon mocked him and said someone would have a hard time from now on. After leaving the hospital, the two of them went to a bar and drank. Do Janggon felt good, but then he asked if he could drink in this state. Jo Taemoon asked if he didn't remember how he taught them to drink to heal wounds. Do Janggon laughs and says it's been a while since he heard that line. They both continue to drink and remember their past in the army when they worked together. Jo Taemoon said he always knew that Do Janggon was strong, but he didn't know he would defeat so many people in such a short amount of time. Moreover, He won the fight with his bare hands. He said he also had guns ready in case he needed them. Janggon asks how he got the gun. While pouring more drinks, Jo Tae-moon informed him that rifles were easily available, but he had smuggled a revolver from Russia. Janggon said Jo Tae-moon had found a suitable job for him. Jo Tae-moon replied that the army suits him better. He also says Special Forces is also a good fit for Janggon, and asks why he left the job. Janggon becomes morose and says he and his 3 juniors participated in the mission, but he was the only one who came back alive. Jo Tae-moon was surprised. Janggon said he felt he no longer had the right to continue this work, so he quit. He thought they would come in his dreams, but they never did. He thought maybe they really hated him. Jo Tae-moon also asked him to drink again. After a while, they both looked at all the empty bottles and realized that they had drunk a lot. Janggon stood up and said he was leaving. Jo Tae-moon asked how he was going to get home now. Janggon said he would take the bus because he wanted to sleep on the bed. Jo Tae-moon thought he could book him a room at the hotel and he could leave tomorrow, but Janggon rejected it. Janggon was currently leaving while walking on the sidewalk. He felt like he had eaten too much, so he sat down on the bench, but he drank too much, so he fell asleep on the park bench. It wasn't long before a van from the Homeless Guidance Center passed him and stopped. Seeing Janggon lying on the bench, several workers saw this drunk man with both hands paralyzed lying there. They decided to take him in and give him some guidance, so they took him with them to the welfare facility. Janggon wakes up and sees a dream. He was in a field, and it was very dark. Everywhere someone calls his name. He turned sharply when the voice came from behind. He saw 2 men in uniform. Both wore the same dog tag. Janggon recognized them. They were his junior partners on the mission. Suddenly he saw a gun by his feet. Janggon takes it and holds it to his head, saying if this is what they want, he will do it. But suddenly he wakes up from his dream. He saw a man clap his hands in front of his face to wake him up. Janggon sits up, but his arm still hurts. He asks the man who he is and where he is now. The man told him that his name was Lee Sun-jo and this place was a welfare facility. He told me it was a convict's clothes and wanted to explain more. But while he was explaining all that, Janggon stood up and left. Lee Sun-jo asked him where he was going. Janggon replied that he was going home. He then stopped near the door because it was locked. He wondered why the door was locked from the inside. Lee Sun-jo said he would explain that this was a place where people were forcibly imprisoned. Janggon is surprised and asks what he is talking about. But someone calls them from behind and asks what are they doing standing there. Lee Sun-jo told Janggon that that person was their platoon leader and had a bad temper. Therefore he warned Janggon not to disturb him, but Janggon saw the key pinned to his arm and asked him to give him the key to the door. The man looked at him so angrily that Janggon kicked his leg and he screamed in pain. He wanted to punch him in the face, but then remembered what the doctor had told him about not being able to use his arms, so he stopped. 2 of the leader's subordinates asked for permission to destroy Janggon. The man also ordered them to just send him to prison. One of them moved forward to hit him. Janggon thought he could defeat them even with his injured arm. But if Lee Sun-jo was right and they were imprisoned there by force, it would be difficult to escape with an injured arm. In order to escape from here, his arm needed to be properly healed, but the wound would likely worsen if the arm was hit, even if by accident. So he thought about what he should do. At the same time, Lee Sun-jo came forward and told them that this man just came last night and didn't know where he was, and he didn't know who the great platoon leader was. Because of that, he behaved arrogantly. The man thought that it made sense. Lee Sun-jo said they should give him one chance and he would educate him properly. The man thought, and Lee Sun-jo whispered to Janggon to beg for mercy and said that it was all his fault. Janggon is still in shock, processing what happened here, but he lowers his head and apologizes. But the man punched him in the head and told him to behave better. Then he asked everyone to go and prepare for the call. While marching, Lee Sun-jo told him that he did well, and he would explain things later. Janggon observes that the man is counting people. There were 24 people including the new guy and he started unlocking the door. On their way out, Janggon asked Lee Sunjo where they were going, and he replied that they would have breakfast. After listening to Janggon's breakfast, he became happy. He looked around and thought that this wasn't even a military base, but they all looked alike. Besides, this wasn't even a prison, but detaining people. But the strangest thing for Janggon was that they called trash in front of him breakfast. He wanted to stab the person in charge of the food with his chopsticks on the forehead, but they only gave them cutlery. While eating food, Lee Sunjo told him this place was a place where homeless people were brought in and guided. Janggon said he was not homeless, but Lee Sunjo said everyone in prison said the same thing. This place is actually where there are people who are captured and forced to work. The state funds every homeless person here, and to get that money, welfare facilities lock people up. Janggon is surprised to hear that and asks who did this and what kind of human could do that. Suddenly, two men entered the room. Lee Sunjo told him that these were people who did this to humans. Both of them are the director's sons. The one with the glasses is Park Gwang, the vice president here. The taller one is Park Yom, and he is the general manager. Janggon looks at them and says that they look like the president is on an inspection. Lee Sunjo said now was Janggon's chance to please those powerful people. There, Park Gwang approached Janggon and asked him how he got this wound on his arm. Lee Sunjo told him that Janggon was a new convict who came here last night. Park Gwang asked if it was possible for him to live comfortably like this. Lee Sunjo said he would take good care of him and would teach him everything. Park Gwang also appreciated his efforts. Lee Sunjo said he wanted to be the model student he got. Park Gwang smiled and said he would remember his name the next time he chose. Now, Janggon also discovered Lee Sunjo's real motive for being so kind to him. Park Gwang asked Janggon if the food here tastes good. He replied that the food is very bad here. Park Gwang, who looked irritated, asked what he just said. Lee Sunjo also started to worry because he was fine in front of the platoon leader, but now he was acting up again. Janggon says he doesn't think this food is even for humans because it's all so rotten. Park Gwang lifted his tray of food and poured it on Janggon's head. He said he should thank them for giving him this food. He then smashes the tray on his head and asks how he dares complain about anything. He then threw the tray at Janggon's head. Blood rushed into Janggon's eyes in anger, but he did nothing because of his broken arm. Park Gwang shouted at Lee Sunjo to teach him so he wouldn't say such crazy things anymore. After they left, Lee Sunjo asked if he was okay. But Janggon looks very angry because of it. Janggon dusted himself off after the insult. He was upset because he couldn't even clean himself properly due to his fractured arm. Afterwards, Janggon and Lee Sunjo swept the ground outside because this was the job assigned to them. Janggon complained because his clothes still weren't dry, but Lee Sunjo said the clothes were automatic when he worked. He then says he should be relieved that Park Gwang did this to him before bath time. Otherwise, he would have had to wait to clean himself. Janggon replied that it was unethical to do this to people before or after bathing. Then all of a sudden, the inmate's bald old man comes there with clothes to wash and agrees with Janggon. Janggon noticed that his way of speaking was a bit strange. Lee Sunjo called him His Highness and asked why he was here. Janggon wonders if he means the president when he calls him His Majesty. A man then calls him from behind and says, His Highness is said to be washing rags, so what is he doing out there? His Highness rushes away, asking why he is always the one doing the laundry. Janggon asks why the man is referred to as a noble and why he talks like he is the president. Lee Sunjo said it was not because he was impersonating the president, but he thought he was the president. He told me that he was an old man who came back from the Vietnam War and went crazy. He saw something and had a nightmare. He dreaded the sight of the bald president and shut him up every time he saw him on the news. As he aged, he became bald, and he couldn't look in the mirror because it reminded him of the bald president's presence. Janggon says it's a shame he has to suffer. He asked Lee Sunjo how he knew so much about him, and he answered that the old man's friend was also locked up here, and he told him everything, but died due to some disease. Janggon is shocked and asks if he died in this place. Lee Sunjo said many people died here. Some were injured, some were sick, or some were beaten by staff or platoon leaders. He then asked if Janggon remembered the platoon leader saying he would send him to prison. He said if someone was sent to prison, they would not care for him there. They would leave him until he died. Janggon said that these people were very evil. Suddenly, the platoon leader called everyone to gather on the sports field. Lee Sunjo told him that today was investigation day, and he could see the worst person among all the bad guys. Janggon wonders what he's talking about. All of the detainees stood to listen to the director of the welfare facility. His name is Park In-jae. Everyone bowed before him, and he started talking and said there are various trees in the world, each of which has its uses. Similarly, humans also have their uses according to their prospective character and potential. Yet those who stood before him were worthless beings who were completely worthless on the outside. He called them crooked, unattractive trees. Then he said that just like Jesus, he became a carpenter to prune useless trees like them so they could find their worth. Everyone started clapping. Janggon didn't like all the nonsense he said shamelessly. While pretending to listen, he paid attention to the structure of the welfare facility. This place was created by cutting the middle of the mountain. Most of this place is surrounded by high walls. The only place without walls was the cliff where the mountain was cut. There was only one main gate, but the guards would attack him simultaneously if he tried to escape through the gate, so it was difficult to escape this hand. The speech finally ended, and Park In-jae walked down the stage. He hugs his sons and thanks them for taking care of this place. Then Park Gwang came on stage and announced the names of the inmates who were selected as model students. Lee Sunjo was excited and hoped he could be selected as a model student. Janggon asks him what an honor student is. He replied that it was the person selected to be sent home from the welfare facility. Park Gwang said that the person chosen this time was from Platoon 4. Park Gwang called Kwak Do-yong to the stage. Kwak Do-yong thanks him and says he is happy that he can finally come home. Lee Sunjo felt envious seeing that. Kwak Do-yong was then taken to the staff office where he asked when he would be discharged. Park Gwang told him that the doctor would come to check on his health one last time before he was sent home. After a while, the doctor came there to do a general examination and declared that he was healthy. Then he gave him an injection, saying it was the nutrition that would keep him healthy on the outside. Soon, Kwak Do-yong was unconscious. Two people then started taking him outside. When they brought him, Park Gwang asked them to take off his clothes because newcomers could use them to save money. The doctor said that Park Gwang was amazing and asked how he could even think about saving in this situation. Park Yom replies that he is no nonsense like he who risked all his money and is now working under him. He warned the doctor not to cross the line if he wanted to save himself. Time had passed, and Kwak Do-yong was lying unconscious in the operating room. The doctor asked his assistant what today's order was about. He said it was liver and kidney. His assistant then asked if it was okay not to give this person anesthetic gas because he could wake up at any moment. But the doctor took it as an insult and asked his assistant to do as he asked. Meanwhile, Kwak Do-yong wakes up and sits wondering where he is. The doctor told him that they were checking him, therefore he didn't need to be afraid. He also punched the doctor in the face and ran away from there. Kwak Do-yong didn't understand why he was here, even though they said he could go home. At the turn, he saw Park Yom walking. Park Yom looks very intimidating in front of Kwak Do-yong. Park Yom then punched Kwak Do-yong in the face. Kwak Do-yong was then dragged back to the operating room by Park Yom. After they entered, the door closed. Jo Tae-moon and his subordinates sat down at a restaurant to eat. His subordinates informed Jo Tae-moon that Park Gwan-ho and his men were hospitalized, so their organization was paralyzed for now. As a result, Congressman Choi's office grants them the right to operate the slot machine business. Immediately, Jo Tae-moon put down his bowl and laughed loudly, saying he would drink until he was drunk. His subordinates told him that Congressman Choi somehow already knew everything that happened in one day, and he said he would give them the business right away. Jo Tae-moon said Choi was a smart old man and had quick decision-making, which made him a member of parliament. His subordinates then said that Choi wanted them to cut the ribbon to celebrate the opening of the slot machine. Jo Tae-moon has no problem with this. While eating fried dumplings, Jo Tae-moon recalled the time when Janggon asked about this restaurant's food. The driver said that the fried dumplings here are really good. Janggon came out and said that he would be back soon. Jo Tae-moon agrees that these fried dumplings are really delicious. But he was worried whether Janggon would get home safely because his arm was injured. Meanwhile, Janggon closes the spray bottle at the welfare facility. Lee Sunjo said that Janggon hadn't told him his name, so he asked his name. Janggon replied that his name was Janggon. Then Lee Sunjo asked him about the work he used to do outside. Janggon starts to think and replies that he usually does work that uses physical strength. Lee Sunjo asked if he injured his arm at work. Janggon then thought of when the fat man hit him with a chair and said yes. It wasn't long before the platoon leader came over and asked if they needed to talk a lot during their work. Lee Sunjo became frightened and apologized to him. The platoon leader asks Janggon what he did in front of the vice president to make him angry. Before he could answer, the platoon leader asked him to forget the question and be more careful next time, then asked if he understood. Janggon just kept silent. The platoon leader then hit him on the head and asked him to answer. Janggon gritted his teeth and answered yes. He looked at the key hanging from his arm and asked Lee Sunjo why the door was locked from the inside. They should have locked it from the outside if they wanted to lock it. Lee Sunjo answered that a long time ago someone came for an inspection and said it was troublesome to lock from the outside because it looked like a prison. Since that day, they closed the door from inside. He adds that they choose people to be platoon leaders who have no outside authority, so they are obsessed with their newfound power and don't take them prisoners. Janggon finally understood the whole situation now. Lee Sunjo said he felt jealous because the man would be home now, but he was trapped here. Elsewhere, the doctor hands over a box of organs to General Manager Park Yom. The doctor asks Park Yom to tell the vice president that he completed everything without incident. Park Yom looked at him and then kicked him in the stomach. He told him to call the vice president sir. He then told him that he should accept his mistake and reflect on it. Park Yom then throws an envelope of money in front of him and leaves. The doctor forgot all the pain and guilt when he saw the money and started thinking about today's winnings and gambling. General Manager Park Yom then went to the smugglers and gave them the organ box. They then paid him a large sum. Park Yom then went back to his father's place and gave him all the money. His father praises his good work and asks him to rest as delivering the box must be difficult. Then he put the money in a safe full of cash and locked it after that. Time passed and everyone was sleeping there. But he suddenly woke up. Janggon thought that he had been there for 4 days and was used to this life. The experience of intensive training while active in the army really helped him adapt to this environment. But the one thing that still amused him was the food here. But he had no other choice until his arm healed. So he made himself believe that he was on a covert operation to survive here. He thought that back then he was afraid of nothing, even life-threatening missions. But now he was worried about one thing. He couldn't see Seong-seong-ah during lunch break. He was worried what if Seong-seong forgot about him. Meanwhile, on the other side, Seong-seona was also waiting for him and looked at the door expecting Janggon. But when the door opened, it wasn't Janggon who appeared. Her colleague then advised her to take a lunch break and she would stand guard. While standing outside the bank, Seong-seona questions why Janggon hasn't appeared for several days. Seong-seona remembers when Janggon left. He said he would come back with money. Seong-seona hopes that Janggon is fine and that nothing bad happens to him. Seong-seona hopes that Janggon is not injured, but on Janggon's side, his hand is injured. Seong-seona wondered if Janggon had had an accident. At that time, the platoon leader slapped Janggon because he was working too slowly. To protect him, His Highness tells him that he will go the extra mile to compensate for this, and asks not to hit him as he is injured. The platoon leader then grabbed his noble by the collar and shouted at him to stop talking nonsense and calling him a madman. His Highness replied that he had not lost his mind and was the president of the country. The platoon leader then punched him in the face and walked away. Janggon, who saw His Majesty crying in pain, started to get angry and stood up. In his anger, he called the platoon leader to stop and called him a dog. After hearing Janggon summon the dog platoon leader, everyone in the room was terrified. The platoon leader turned his head angrily and asked if he had gone mad. Janggon remained calm and did not answer him. The platoon leader's two underlings looked at him angrily. Janggon saw them and thought that before the two people got in the way, he would kill them as fast as he could. The platoon leader ran towards him to attack him, but Janggon jumped in the air and kicked him. The kick was so hard that the platoon leader fell to the ground and became unconscious. They both then ran towards him to hit Janggon. Janggon thought it was difficult to handle three people at the same time when both his arms were injured, but these two were different, and he could beat them easily. He looked at one of them and grinned to make him lose his cool, and it worked. The man attacked him repeatedly, but Janggon dodged every time, then finds the right moment and kicks his back knee. The man grimaced in pain. Then Janggon throws up and kicks his chin, then knocks him down. He then threw one kick at the last man and knocked out all his opponents there. People were shocked to see one person beating three people. After doing that, Janggon realized that he was losing his temper. He might get in trouble if employees come there and see all this mess. Suddenly, Lee Sunjo started cheering his name, and all the other prisoners followed suit. He tries to cover it up, but they ignore him. Janggon gets worried. If any welfare workers come now, things will become even more complicated for him. Not long after, what he was worried about happened. A worker comes inside and asks what all the noise is about. Suddenly, every prisoner closed their mouths. When the man saw the platoon leader who fell to the ground, he took out his baton and pointed it at Janggon and asked if he was the one who did this. Janggon didn't say anything, and he thought he could get rid of him if he kicked him throwing away his stick, then headbutted him in the face, and then kicked him in the stomach. He asked himself whether he should subdue this person and get out of here. But in the end, he will be blocked by a high wall of steel gates, and they will try to stop him with full force. In that situation, it would be difficult for him to protect his arm. He could knock down some of them without using his arms, but if he got a more severe arm injury, he wouldn't be able to escape. So the best course of action to take now is to apologize. So he bends down in front of him and says he did all that by mistake. At the same time, both brothers come there. Park Gwang asked if he was the one who caused this mess. Janggon realizes that things can't get any more complicated than they are now. Park Gwang said it was amazing that a single man with an injured arm defeated three people by himself. He says he thought Janggon was just a fool who couldn't stand up for himself and could only complain about food. But it turns out he's much more than that. Then Park Gwang asked what Janggon's name was and what he was thinking while doing this. But Park Gwang said that he doesn't care what Janggon thinks. He was angry about the fact that Janggon thought, and it was a big problem. Janggon gets confused with Park Gwang. Park Gwang told him the rule was that platoon members must always listen to their leader. He had made those rules and others had to follow them no matter what. Park Yom glares at his face and says he can still see that Janggon is still thinking. Park Gwang then said that Janggon would be in the punishment room for 3 days. Even Lee Sunjo was surprised to hear this sentence. Janggon thinks it sounds like a prison cell, and 3 days in a cell is not a big deal. Park Gwang laughed hysterically and said that when he returned from that room, he would have no thoughts. However, Park Gwang told him to reflect on himself in these 3 days during his sentence. He waited for an answer, but Janggon didn't speak and kept looking into his eyes. Park Gwang turned around and looked at his brother for a sign. Park Yom walks up to him and calls his name, but Janggon doesn't answer, so he punches him in the face until his nose breaks and it starts bleeding. Then he told him to answer Park Gwang. Janggon said yes twice. Then the man kicked him in the stomach and told Janggon to hit back just once. Park Yom pushes Janggon's limits, but he has to stay calm. So he answered again and said yes. Park Yom hits him again, telling him to answer loudly and clearly. Park Gwang thought before sending Janggon to the punishment room, he wanted to set an example for others so that they would not rebel against him. Then, employees took him outside to lock him in the punishment room. Lee Sunjo was worried about what would happen to him in the punishment room. Janggon then looked back and smiled at Lee Sunjo. Lee Sunjo thought he must have gotten too smacked on the head a few times after seeing him smile. While walking towards the punishment room, Janggon thinks about the punch and says General Manager Park Yom's fist is quite strong. But he smiled, thinking that his boxing was better, and he wanted to fight with him once his arm was completely healed. The welfare facility employee then hit him on the head and asked him to hurry up. He replies that he will come and thinks he will also hit this guy. Park Yom slaps the unconscious platoon leader in the face. After being hit, he finally opened his eyes. Annoyed, he shouted who did it, but he saw Park Yom in front of him and closed his mouth automatically. Park Yom tells him to come with him and tells the other workers to go back to work because their break time is over. They then took him outside. Park Gwang told him that he didn't think he was fit to be a platoon leader anymore. He replied that it was not, and that he could become the leader. Park Gwang then asks him how he can say that after being beaten and crushed by a man who can't even use his arms. He takes his badge and asks how can he lead if weak. But the platoon leader thought that he was not weak, but Janggon was much stronger and had nimble feet. But he couldn't tell Park Gwang because he would be transferred as platoon leader after that. So he lied and said that he was attacked from behind. Because of that, he couldn't protect himself. Park Gwang then asked if he wanted to say he could beat him in a real fight. Park Gwang orders him to go and beat him now. The platoon leader was frightened and asked if he should fight him. Park Gwang asks him how he can lead a platoon after being knocked out in front of his people. He tells him that he has sent Janggon to the punishment cell for 3 days. In fact, he was shocked to hear about Janggon getting a 3-day sentence there. Park Gwang said that the fight between them would happen after he came out of the punishment room and after Janggon lost his mind. Now the platoon leader understood why Janggon was sent there on purpose. He will be mentally and physically weak after coming out, and he can beat him easily. Park Gwang patted him on the shoulder and asked if he could do this. Finally, the platoon leader said yes. Janggon was taken to the basement by officers. There was a big cell created there and they entered it. Janggon saw some small rooms and thought he would be taken to solitary confinement, but he wondered why they made isolation rooms in the basement. Then he was surprised when the man opened the room and asked him to come in. The reason was that it wasn't a room, but rather a locker that a person could barely fit inside. Janggon wonders if they are punishing innocent people by locking them in here. The officer then shouted at him to move quickly and pointed his cane at Janggon's arm, then told him to get in before his arm was broken. Janggon finally gets inside and barely fits in there. He couldn't even stand up straight. The door was finally closed and the entire cell was dark and empty. Janggon thought that when he was in military training, he was trained in all forms of torture that might occur when captured by the enemy. Indoor torture is one of them. It is a torture where one cannot sit or lie down so one cannot sleep properly in an uncomfortable position. They can't even eat, drink, or even pee. The person is forced to remain in this position. According to him, this kind of torture is used to break the enemy physically and mentally. But Janggon was furious that they could use this kind of torture on normal people. However, what was more worrying now was that he would have to spend 3 days here. The 6th day begins when the sun illuminates the sky and spreads beauty outward. 1 day has passed since Janggon was locked up in that punishment cell, but he can't keep track of the time and all other happenings outside. He wondered if it had been a day. He was exhausted, but he continued to fall asleep and woke up in a standing position. He wasn't sure if he was asleep or just opened his eyes briefly, but on top of all this, he felt very hungry. He wanted to eat, and his tongue kept saying one word, food. On the other side in the 3rd platoon hall, Lee Sunjo was beaten by the platoon leader. Everyone present there was terrified seeing him like this. Lee Sunjo cried in pain because he wasn't used to it. The platoon leader shouted at him and said that he knew Lee Sunjo sided with Janggon while he was unconscious. He asks how he is happy now to be beaten for siding with him. Lee Sunjo tried to say something, but the platoon leader kicked his leg and covered his mouth. He tried to make other people feel ashamed, because they were all involved in the rebellion scheme. Now everyone is hiding their faces like they know nothing about it. The platoon leader then grabbed Lee Sunjo by the hair and said he would show him what happens to people who go against their leader. Then he hit him in the face with his knee and threw him to the floor. He kept hitting him with his feet. His Majesty comes to him and asks him to stop this brutality and asks why he is taking it out on him. The platoon leader saw him and then kicked him so he fell on top of Lee Sunjo. Elsewhere, Park Gwang and Park Yom are waiting for their father to pack the money in a shoebox in the director's office. He puts the money in a bag and says this is a bribe for a government employee. He prepared 3 bags and said the amount of money was the same, so they just had to deliver it. Park Gwang also asked Park Yom to come with him this time, and he agreed. Park Gwang then saw a large box of money kept separately on the floor and asked, "What about that one?" His father told him to leave this one here because it was for someone else. Park Yom asks why there is so much money in this box, and his father tells him that the people who received this box are more than government employees. He is a very important key to the management of this country. Park Gwang and Park Yom also drove the car to deliver the money. On his way, Park Yom asks about how these people can help them in their business and get this gift in return. Park Gwang replied that they helped in various ways. They arrived at the welfare department of Daesan City Hall. The employee said he was grateful. This helps them to get government funding. Park Gwang replied that he felt obligated to do more for themselves. In the seaside town, they meet the head of the Daesan police station. After looking at the shoebox, the man said these shoes look good and heavy. Park Gwang bowed his head in respect and said that he should travel around the country for the citizens. So he asked him to keep doing what he was doing and running around in the shoes they gave him. And finally, they gave him to the Daesan district prosecutor on an empty street and gave him his gift. They suppress any attempts by whistleblowers to expose welfare facilities to the public. The prosecutor held the bag in a way that seemed to guess its weight. He speaks in code and says that he likes apples, but pears will do this time. Park Gwang bowed his head and assured him that he would bring apples once the season came. After the prosecutor leaves, Park Gwang mutters that he doesn't need to be picky about it and takes what they give him. He then gave some money to Park Yom. Park Yom is shocked and asks if he took some of the bribe money. Park Gwang answered yes and asked how they could bribe someone if they didn't get anything for the trouble they had. He tells him that he also took some bribes last time and no one found them. That's why he brought Park Yom here. He says as brothers should share good things. Park Yom thanks him for looking after him. After sitting in the car, Park Gwang asked him to go to eat something good because they had done a good job. After arriving at the restaurant, they ordered some meat cooked by themselves. Park Gwang put a piece of meat and some seasonings on a lettuce leaf and fed Park Yom with his hands. Seeing his younger brother chewing food, Park Gwanho said that he ate very well. They also enjoyed their meal. In the middle, Park Yom asks if Park Gwang is serious about forcing the leader of Squad 3 and Janggon to fight once he comes out. But Park Gwang believes a man who has been in the punishment room for 3 days has no chance of winning. Park Yom replies that he knows there is no chance of winning for normal people in this situation, but Janggon knocks out 3 men with broken arms. Park Yom said he thinks this might happen. Park Gwang interrupts him and asks Park Yom if he thinks Janggon will be of use to them if he is really strong. Park Yom asked how Park Gwang got him to listen to him when he could beat up a platoon leader and his men. Park Gwang said it was almost impossible for now, but if he destroyed him this time because of the punishment room, he could make him follow his every order. 2 days finally passed since Janggon was locked up in the punishment room. Janggon couldn't sleep for 2 days in a row. His face looked like a soldier who had lost his country. He was very hungry, and his mouth was saying the words of all the food he could think of right now. He gave his mind and body a reason to keep on living and not give up. Besides, back then he thought of another reason to keep fighting. It was Miss Seona. Her beautiful face and sweet smile appeared in his mind. Janggon remembered that he had never asked her out to eat. He imagined the scene in his mind when he asked Seona to have dinner with him, and Seona would happily accept his invitation. And when Seona asks what they should eat, he will answer that it doesn't matter as long as he eats with her. He said these words while trying hard to keep himself alive. The 3rd day of punishment had finally ended in this punishment room. The next day when the lockers were opened, Janggon fell to the ground because he didn't have the strength to control his body. He could barely lift his neck and look up. Park Gwang looked at him and smirked while saying that these were the eyes he wanted to see. Park Gwang ordered them to quickly move Janggon from here. Janggon lay on the floor and couldn't move because of the lack of energy. Lee Sunjo and His Highness, who were standing near their bars, came there and helped Janggon up by supporting him. Lee Sunjo looked at him and said he didn't look good and they should move him fast. They helped Janggon walk and they all followed Park Gwang. While passing through an empty lot, Janggon saw Lee Sunjo's face and asked him if he was okay and what happened to his face. Lee Sunjo told him that he was beaten by the platoon leader for siding with him that day, and they also beat His Majesty for raising his voice for Lee Sunjo. His Majesty smiles and says he is fine. When Janggon looks at him, he feels sorry for him. He asked Lee Sunjo where they were going because he was starving and wanted to eat something. Lee Sunjo replied that they were not going to eat at this time. All the prisoners gathered in the field and looked fearfully at the platoon leader. The platoon leader looks ready to fight. Janggon was also brought here, but he looked miserable as he was barely standing. He understood that they were trying to make him fight the platoon leader as soon as he came out of the punishment room. The platoon leader remembered what Park Gwang had told him that day. He had to save some face after getting beat up in front of everyone. He thought that he had already won this fight. All he has to do is defeat Janggon while acting as if nothing is wrong. Park Gwang laughed and said it was like watching a gladiator duel. But Park Yom didn't laugh at his joke. He looks at Janggon and says that this is more like an execution than a duel. But Park Gwang says it will still be fun to watch. He then ordered his officers to start the fight. Both of them were brought in front of each other. The referee tells them to start when he gives them the signal. The weak Janggon thought that he wanted to rest for a while. The platoon leader looked at his friends as they tried to say something. The referee finally gave the signal to start the fight. The platoon leader shouted like he was trying to intimidate Janggon. At that moment, he remembered yesterday's meeting with his friends. He tells them he will fight Janggon once he gets out. He was still worried because they all knew how strong Janggon was and how he beat them all with his feet. He said that Janggon would not be in the best condition after his discharge, but he still wanted to ensure his victory in the fight. His friend told him that there is one way. He said that Janggon's arm was injured, so he had to kick his arm when the fight started. He was sure it would hurt him like hell, and he wouldn't be able to fight back. The platoon leader also said it was a cheap trick, but that was what could give him victory. When the fight started, the platoon leader ran towards him while shouting at full power. Meanwhile, Janggon moves from his place and thinks this will end if he gets beaten. So he wanted to let him beat him up and finish it quickly because he had no desire to fight. But suddenly he remembered his injured arm, and he couldn't just let him beat him like that. When the platoon leader threw a kick towards his arm, he bent backwards to avoid it. The platoon leader didn't expect it and was shocked. Janggon turned to attack and threw a kick at the platoon leader's stomach. The platoon leader screamed in pain and his face turned red. Park Yom was surprised to see his moves and wondered if he practiced martial arts. Park Gwang laughed in amusement. Tears and saliva flowed from the platoon leader's eyes and mouth. He thought if Janggon had just come out of the punishment room, but how could he be so strong? Janggon then saw Lee Sunjo's injured face and His Majesty who was beaten for cheering for him that day. This increased Janggon's anger, and the desire for revenge emerged in his mind. He turned to the platoon leader. The platoon leader could see what would happen to him next. Janggon kicked him in the face and broke his nose so it bled. This one strike sent him crashing to the ground. Everyone's eyes forgot to blink because everyone there was so shocked. Janggon then continued to beat him with kicks to his face. The platoon leader's friends were frightened by what was happening there. Lee Sunjo got excited and once again started cheering for Janggon. His Majesty is also happy and says he has always believed in him. The platoon leader seemed to be half dead when foam came out of his mouth. Janggon then approached Park Gwang and asked him if he was satisfied now. Park Gwang smiled and replied that he was a funny guy. And yes, he was completely satisfied. Janggon said he would go. But before he finished his sentence, Janggon lost consciousness and fell to the ground. The referee ran over to him to check if he was okay. Park Gwang asked about what happened to him. Referee sees his face and says he is sleeping. Park Gwang smirked and said this guy was really funny, and he had thought of a good and fun idea for him. Janggon was sleeping soundly, but suddenly he opened his eyes. He saw Lee Sunjo standing beside him, excited to see him wake up. Janggon looked weak and couldn't open his eyes properly. He asked in a weak voice what happened. Lee Sunjo replied while yawning that he fell asleep, and Lee Sunjo brought him here. He also skipped work today to be here with her. Janggon tried to sit up, but suddenly he saw a ribbon and key stuck to his arm and asked Lee Sunjo what this was. Lee Sunjo told him that the vice president crowned him as the new leader of the 3rd platoon while he was asleep. Janggon looks at him and asks if he's serious. Park Gwang and Park Yom are in the office. Park Yom looks a little worried about something. Park Gwang made tea and added 2 spoonfuls of tea sugar and milk each. He then gave his teacup to Park Yom and asked him to be careful because it was hot. While sipping his tea, Park Yom asked him what he was thinking at that time. Park Gwang said what he meant. He said he didn't like the taste of the tea because it tasted good to him. Park Yom replies that he's not talking about that, but he does ask why he made Janggon the platoon leader. Park Gwang replied that the first and most important reason was that the previous leader was weaker than he expected, and Janggon was stronger than he thought, so he would come in handy when they needed him. Park Yom said that he thinks Janggon is not just an ordinary person who knows how to fight. He also thinks about his fighting style and says Janggon is definitely a trained fighter. Park Gwang asked him what he wanted to say here. Park Yom replies that if Janggon's arm heals completely, they might not be able to control it anymore. Park Gwang then asked if he knew about this. He says only hire one of their workers to lead the platoon. He told Park Yom to imagine if 30 prisoners attacked one employee at the same time, it would not take much effort to defeat one worker. If they think about it according to the physical aspect, it makes sense. But not a single prisoner came out in rebellion and attacked that one employee. Park Gwang asked why they hesitated to do it. Park Yom answered that there are 2 possibilities. The first reason, they hate each other, or they think that other employees can quickly provide help. Even if they tried, they knew they would most likely only get as far as the barricades and walls, and then they would be beaten and put in the punishment room. Park Gwang answered that that wasn't the exact reason why they didn't rebel, but because fear and helplessness control them and keep them obedient. In Southeast Asia, when they train elephants, they tie up baby elephants and beat them with iron hooks to make them afraid of humans. Even when the elephant grows big and can trample a person to death, it cannot do so because it is afraid of humans. Janggon was like that baby elephant. They had to train him the same way they would train anyone else. Park Yom asked if it was really necessary to make Janggon a platoon leader. Park Gwang says it is necessary because this position will relax him, and as time passes, he will accept this place as his home like the others. At that time, Janggon was sitting on his bed. Meanwhile, the 2 subordinates of the previous platoon leader sat down on the floor nearby. They asked Janggon to forgive them for what they did to him in the past. Janggon is informed that the former platoon leader was sent to prison after the fight, and now his followers are begging for their lives on their knees. He told them that they apologized to him, but he could not forgive them. Their faces turned gloomy, and they asked why. Janggon tells them that he cannot forgive them because he has nothing to forgive. He had not been there long and held no grudge against either of them. They also look relieved, but then Janggon says they are the ones who should be apologized for. Janggon then yawned and told them to talk it over among themselves since he was going to sleep again. The 2 of them kept screaming for help to save them, but Janggon turned his head away and fell asleep. After Janggon wakes up, he wonders if lying down like that ever made him this happy. Then he saw the keys and the armband and wondered why they were giving him these things. He remembered that they were just about to make an example of him when he walked out of the punishment room. They hoped to save some face for the platoon leader from his final defeat, but then their plans were ruined by him. When he took the guy down, they might send him to jail because he was no longer of any use after losing to him twice to him. Janggon could understand their plan up to this point, but what could be the reason for making him the platoon leader? Janggon started grinning and saying how adorable they were. According to Janggon, they have never met anyone smarter than them because of the rotten environment around them, or they don't know that other people are not as selfish as they are. Janggon decided that he would do what they wanted for now because this was the best way. At the Daesan Hotel, there is a celebration of the opening day of the casino and dining room. All the decorations were made according to Taemoon, and Choi was ready to cut the ribbon. The speaker announces the ribbon-cutting ceremony will begin and begins the countdown. When the count was up, they finally cut the ribbon and the media took their photos. Then Choi shook hands with Taemoon, congratulating him on this big day. Taemoon respectfully bowed his shoulders and expressed his thanks to Senator Choi. But in his mind, he called him an old bastard and said if he hadn't had a tug-of-war between him and Park Gwon-ho, he wouldn't have had to wait this long. The senator's secretary then reminded him that it was time for his next appointment. So he goes and says they will meet soon and discuss what they couldn't do today. Taemoon bowed his head and congratulated him on his journey. After they leave, his secretary tells him that the senator has left and he can stand up straight now. Taemoon was annoyed because he knew the senator would call to see him again, and that meant his secretary would have to prepare another box of apples for him. Then Taemoon invited everyone to go eat. One of his underlings asked where they should go eat. Taemoon replied that they would go to a place where the dumplings were delicious, but they could order whatever they wanted. While the treats were going on, Taemoon looked happy today, so he enjoyed it with them as well. His secretary poured him a drink. He said that Taemoon had done a good job, but he suddenly became moody while drinking, so his secretary asked him what was the reason for this sudden sadness. He says if this is because of the money to give to the senator, he doesn't need to worry as he can make a lot of money with this new business. Taemoon said, money is nice, but everything is boring. He said that when he first started it, he liked it because everything had a clear set of rules. The strongest person will get to the top. Just like that, he got rid of the weak and made it here. But now that he had the business, he had to hold himself up front like a senator. Taemoon said that business rules are dirty. After dinner, Taemoon said goodbye to his men who bowed before him. On the way home, he asked the driver to drop him off there. His subordinate warned that they were still a little far from home and he was also drunk. Taemoon assured him that he just wanted to take a walk. He will come to his senses after a walk. On his way, suddenly he was called by Park Gwon-ho and his men in front of him. Taemoon smiled and asked where the others were. Were they still in the hospital? Park Gwon-ho looked at him angrily and said he came here because he had to ask him a few questions. Taemoon said that he knew the rules. If they won against him, he would answer his questions. Park Gwon-ho was annoyed and ordered his men to attack Taemoon. Taemoon got excited and started running towards them. When Taemoon ran towards them, he was greeted by a big man who was waving his wooden staff. But Taemoon could easily avoid it. As if playing games, he said that almost in a mocking tone. Another member of Park Gwon-ho's gang then swung his wooden stick at Taemoon while calling Taemoon an arrogant, impudent person, but Taemoon once again dodged it and responded with a punch to the face very quickly. Taemoon replied that he was not arrogant, but he was just confident in his abilities. The counterattack was so fast that the gang members were almost unconscious and fell down. At that moment, Taemoon punched another enemy. Taemoon asked in a mocking tone where their self-confidence had gone. At that time, the man attacked Taemoon from behind, but Taemoon noticed and punched him. He then turned back and asked where he had been, because he was interrupted in the middle of the conversation. Suddenly, someone strangled him. The big man who was previously fought by Janggon strangled Taemoon and lifted him in the air, saying that he could continue talking nonsense. Taemoon was in pain and had difficulty breathing when he lifted her. Park Gwon-ho's subordinates were happy to see him, but the big man suddenly screamed in pain. The big man was shaking in pain while holding his crotch because he had been kicked hard in the groin. Taemoon, who had been put down, punched the big man in response. After that, Taemoon took a wooden stick and said that the warm-up was finished, but suddenly they were stopped by Park Gwon-ho. He said that this was enough and invited Taemoon to talk. Jo Tae-moon threw away his wooden stick and agreed to Park Gwan-ho's invitation. Jo Tae-moon then asked why Park Gwan-ho was here and whether he wanted to arrest him for stealing the founding rights of a slot machine company. Park Gwan-ho replied no, because revenge would not earn him that right. As he said earlier, Jo Tae-moon wanted to ask Jo Tae-moon something. He asked the person who attacked them alone. Park Gwan-ho told him not to even think about being evasive by saying he wasn't the one because there was no reason to hide it anymore, since he already got the business. Jo Tae-moon replied that it was true and asked what was the reason he was looking for him to get revenge. Jo Tae-moon walked back and said that he would not say anything that Park Gwan-ho did because he already said he would answer if he won. Park Gwan-ho then asked where Janggon was now because he couldn't find him anywhere. Jo Tae-moon answered that he didn't know either, but he told him that Janggon left after drinking with him the night he attacked Park Gwan-ho. Jo Tae-moon even emphasized that he really didn't know where Janggon had gone. After leaving that place, Jo Tae-moon felt uncomfortable because he was drenched in sweat, but he found it a relief. Park Gwan-ho and his subordinates returned to their headquarters. The big man apologized to Park Gwan-ho, but Park Gwan-ho said that he didn't expect much from the start. He knew that even if the man's body was in the best condition, he didn't stand a chance. Suddenly, a loud voice called Park Gwan-ho. Someone arrived at the door and asked what was going on here. He is Sang Cheol, who just came back from reservist training. Park Gwan-ho also told what happened to Sang Cheol. Hearing that Sang Cheol said that this was not what he thought would happen when he went to practice and apologized to Park Gwan-ho. But Park Gwan-ho said that it wasn't his fault that he joined the reservists' training, but Kim Shin-jo's. Sang Cheol then said that he would kill Jo Tae-moon now, but he was stopped by Park Gwan-ho and told him to forget it because he had to do other things. He then asked Sang Cheol if he had heard about the hospital where Jo Tae-moon's subordinate was being treated. Sang Cheol knows that place, which is led by the old man. Park Gwan-ho told that the person who attacked them injured his arm, so he might be hospitalized there. He tells Sang Cheol to go find information about him. Sang Cheol doesn't understand why Park Gwan-ho is targeting Janggon. Even though he was paid by Jo Tae-moon and the one stealing their business was Jo Tae-moon, he asked whether they should target Jo Tae-moon. Park Gwan-ho replied that Janggon had stepped on his pride. For gangsters, that's outrageous. Sang Cheol finally understood and agreed to Park Gwan-ho's order. The next day, the old doctor who had treated Janggon asked where he was injured. Sang Cheol, who was in front of him, answered that it was in his heart because someone was causing trouble with his Hyung-nim. He then suddenly grabbed the old doctor by the head and slammed his head on the table. After being asked, the old doctor finally told him that the name of the man he was treating at that time was Janggon. Sang Cheol then asked for the insurance number and address, but the old doctor didn't know because he didn't ask for data like that from the patient Jo Tae-moon brought. After getting information from the old doctor, Sang Cheol called Park Gwan-ho and told him that he only got his name from the old doctor. Hearing that, Park Gwan-ho told Sang Cheol to visit another place. He told them that the children found the bar where Janggon and Jo Tae-moon were drinking together. Sang Cheol also visited the place and ordered a bottle of soju and udon. After receiving the food he ordered, Sang Cheol asked if he had ever seen anyone with casts on both hands here. When the restaurant owner answered yes, Sang Cheol gave him the money and asked him to tell him about it. He accepted the money and said that Janggon was drunk after drinking several bottles of soju and said he had to go home. He remembered that Janggon said he could go up and he didn't think his house was around here. Soon someone called Sang Cheol loudly. Not far from his table, it turned out that Jo Tae-moon's subordinates were eating there. They asked Sang Cheol what he is doing here. Sang Cheol realized that they were members of Jo Tae-moon's gang and told the shop owner to hide first. When approached by members of Jo Tae-moon's gang, Sang Cheol replied that he wanted to eat udon because he said it was delicious and asked what was wrong with that. One of Jo Tae-moon's gang members looks at him aggressively and asks if he knows this around their area. Sang Cheol looked back and said that he didn't enter his territory and ordered udon. Gang member Jo Tae-moon smiled and said to Sang Cheol that his gang was a mess when he left, and asked if he didn't hear. Suddenly, he was flushed by hot udon. Sang Cheol stood up holding the soju bottle. He then swung the bottle and hit him on the head. After that, Sang Cheol asked the other Jo Tae-moon gang members if they wanted too. The remaining members of Jo Tae-moon's gang hesitate in front of Sang Cheol. Sang Cheol then suddenly kicked one of Jo Tae-moon's gang members in the head. The last member of Jo Tae-moon's gang was scared to see him, but he decided to punch Sang Cheol. But he was met with a fist from Sang Cheol. They finally left the restaurant. Sang Cheol asked the shop owner to continue their conversation earlier. The shop owner told him that Do Janggon might have gone out drunk and said he wanted to take the bus even though there were no buses. So he said that Do Janggon might be sleeping on the street because he couldn't get the bus. Sang Cheol thought that made sense and that he might just get a bus in the morning. He gets annoyed because this is more complicated because Do Janggon has been gone for a long time. But the shop owner said it was possible that Do Janggon was still in this city. When asked why he was so sure, the shop owner said that recently, the Daesan Welfare Facility had been rounding up homeless people and people sleeping on the streets at night. And from what he's heard, you could get arrested just for walking alone at night. Hearing that, Sang Cheol decided to check it out then, at the welfare facility, currently on lunch break. At that time, Do Janggon seemed to be thinking about something. Lee Sunjo, who realized this, asked Do Janggon if he thought of something. Do Janggon replied that he was wondering if he could recover if he ate trash like this. His Highness also offers to find herbal medicine for him. Do Janggon didn't expect that they had herbal medicine here. Lee Sunjo also said that if he could, he would be very grateful. But Lee Sunjo whispered to Do Janggon because they knew how he was. Do Janggon also remembered with a noble state hearing that. Not long after, Park Gwang and Park Yom came to this place and were greeted by the prisoners. Park Gwang then noticed Do Janggon's existence and came over to him. Do Janggon also greeted Park Gwang. Park Gwang then said, however, Do Janggon had been here for quite a while, so he asked how the food was. Hearing that question, Do Janggon was silent for a moment. Lee Sunjo hoped in his heart that Do Janggon would not say extravagant things like before. Do Janggon answered that the food tasted very good. Park Gwang was satisfied with that answer and left Do Janggon. Once they left Lee Sunjo, that was good work. When Park Gwang went out with his sister, he said that as they saw, humans adapt as their environment changes. However, Park Yom wasn't so sure and glanced at Do Janggon, who was chatting with his friends. Park Gwang is very confident that he can master Do Janggon in the near future. On a wall, His Highness is looking for something in a hole in the wall. Lee Sunjo, who witnessed this, asked why he even dug a hole in the wall even though he said he wanted to find herbal medicine. His Highness asked him to be patient first. Lee Sunjo then asked why Do Janggon was also coming. Do Janggon answered Lee Sunjo himself, who ordered him to obey. Besides, there was nothing he could do for the rest of lunchtime. While still in the military, Do Janggon and his friends also spent time with unimportant activities, and he believes the time they spend doing that is a moment where they can feel like ordinary people. He thought moments like that were really needed in a place like this, the Daesan Welfare Facility. His Majesty finally found what he was looking for. He then gave what he found to Do Janggon. Lee Sunjo was surprised because what His Majesty was a baby mouse. His Majesty said that these mice were born from sick mothers, but they were still young, so they were fine to eat. The meat and bones are soft, so he can eat everything. Do Janggon was hesitant when he heard that he had to eat everything, but His Majesty asked, didn't Do Janggon need calcium and protein to heal his hands? Lee Sunjo felt this was too much and asked Do Janggon to leave. Do Janggon wonders in his mind whether His Highness studied this in Vietnam or at the Samchung re-education camp. He also might know from the street when his mind is not in his right mind. Lee Sunjo found it strange that Do Janggon was silent. Do Janggon then said that he was right. At first, Lee Sunjo thought that Do Janggon said he was right, but Do Janggon said that if his hand wants to heal, he needs nutrition, which surprised Lee Sunjo. Do Janggon then took the baby rats from His Highness and immediately ate them. Lee Sunjo, who witnessed that, felt like throwing up. While eating the baby rats, Do Janggon thinks that in order to survive here, he must always remember that he is just an ordinary person. However, in order to survive in this cruel place, he had to be even more ruthless. In the staff room, one of the employees was getting ready to change his clothes. When his friends saw that, he said that he was jealous because he wanted to go home now while he was on duty today. They then asked why he was in such a hurry, even though he was not married and did not have a wife waiting for him at home. Another friend of his said that precisely because he didn't have a wife waiting at home, he was excited to go home. The employee ignored them and said he would go ahead. He bit his nails and thought that he didn't have a wife he wanted to meet, but he had someone else he really wanted to meet. While holding the cards, he was very hopeful. He was gambling in a restaurant. When he saw the cards he got, he thought he would finally win. On the table there are so many piles of money. He thought that he had already borrowed money from the dealer, and it was too late when he realized it. But he thought that it would be fine since he would win. When he heard the results of the other players' cards, he thought that this was good and showed his cards confidently because he got a 9. But another player who had not yet shown his cards asked in a mocking tone whether he was sure that he was lucky with the bad cards. He was annoyed by the taunt, but the player then showed that he had a flush. He was shocked and asked how this could happen. Having lost all the money he had lent him, he was approached by security and invited to hold a private counseling session on how to repay them. Moments later, he was naked and beaten. He didn't understand how it could be like this and why his opponent was able to get a flush. Then suddenly, he heard a loud sound that startled him. Sang-cheol comes and says that he shouldn't think about why he got the royal flush, but should introspect on why he gambled. He then asks who he is, but Sang-cheol replies that he doesn't need to know who he is and asks if he works at the Daesan Welfare Facility. He was surprised and asked how Sang-cheol could know. Sang-cheol didn't answer that, and said that he wanted to ask a few things because he needed confirmation about whether the person he was looking for was there or not. At first he refused because the internal information was confidential. Sang-cheol knew that. That's why he came here to ask him. He was hesitant, but Sang-cheol said that he took over his debt from the townhouse manager, so he owed Sang-cheol now. However, Sang-cheol said that if he did as he was told, he would erase the debt. So once again, Sang-cheol asked if there was anyone named Janggon at the Daesan Welfare Facility. He told me that both of his hands were injured, so it should be easy to find. He also remembered Janggon who fought against the platoon leader before and told Sang-cheol that he was there. Sang-cheol then asked if he could bring Janggon to him because he had to take care of some things with him. Sang-cheol really wants to meet Janggon to kill him. But the welfare facility employee replied that it was impossible because it was completely beyond his control, especially when it comes to sneaking prisoners out of the facility. After thinking for a moment, he asked him if he could go inside. The welfare facility employee also said that Sang-cheol didn't seem to know what kind of place a welfare facility was. He said that the place was worse than the prison out there, and once in, it's nearly impossible to get out. Sang-cheol also said that meant he had to help him. However, the welfare facility employee answered that it was difficult to do because the security was very high, but there was one way. He informed that the facility regularly patrolled at night according to schedule. That's when they arrested homeless people, drunks, and others on the streets of Daesan. If Sang-cheol pretended to be homeless on the date he said, then he could enter the facility without being suspected. Sang-cheol also agreed to the plan. On the announced date, the welfare facility employee asked Sang-cheol if he really wanted to write off his debt. After that, he gave Sang-cheol his prison clothes and asked him to change his clothes. After wearing the shirt, Sang-cheol said that he would write a letter of recommendation regarding the payment of the employee's debt. He is then taken to the 3rd platoon where Janggon is and he tells them to welcome the newcomers. Lee Sunjo wondered how the newcomer ended up here. Janggon came over to Sang-cheol and said that he hoped they could get along well, then introduced his name. Seeing Janggon greet him, he was sure that he was Janggon because both of his hands were in casts. Sang-cheol lowered his head and introduced himself to Janggon and asked Janggon not to speak formally to him. Janggon was surprised by Sang Cheol's reaction. Sang Cheol then said that he didn't know what to do because he was dragged to this place suddenly, but smiled and said that he knew that in the land of Joseon, he had to respect those who were more powerful than him. Janggon laughed awkwardly and asked Lee Sunjo to take Sang Cheol to an empty bed. Lee Sunjo cheerfully asked Sang Cheol to follow him. While bringing Sang Cheol, Lee Sunjo said that from what he saw, he felt that Sang Cheol could blend in well. Sang Cheol replied that he had experience with this kind of environment. Lee Sunjo also said no matter what, just continue with that attitude. But suddenly Sang Cheol called him harshly. With an intimidating look, Sang Cheol asked Lee Sunjo if he had the platoon commander's armband. Lee Sunjo became nervous and answered no. Sang Cheol also asked why Lee Sunjo told him to do this and that. The frightened Lee Sunjo apologized and showed Sang Cheol's bed. Sang Cheol lay down on the bed and closed his eyes. The armband on Janggon's arm, Lee Sunjo felt very jealous. Noticing Lee Sunjo's face, Janggon laughed and asked if he was crying. Lee Sunjo turned his face away and reasoned that he was yawning because he was sleepy. At that time, Sang Cheol thought that he could not believe that Janggon was kidnapped and placed in a situation like this. But Janggon had an armband and was made a platoon leader in this place. However, he thought that it was better for him. He'll pretend to follow this damn role and kill Janggon when he's off guard.